Thank you for being here today. Your likes and subscriptions really means a lot.
After 35 years, my husband traded our entire history for a younger version of me and thought that left me with nothing. My name is Linda. I was 59 years old when a single text message ended 35 years of marriage in under a week. There was a house he wanted half of, a retirement account he wanted split his way. And for 3 days, a woman he wouldn't say out loud, though the message already sitting on his phone had told me everything I needed to know. But that's not even where it starts. The part nobody warned me about wasn't losing Richard. It was almost losing myself first, before I remembered who I was before him. By the end of this, you'll know exactly how much money Richard secretly drained from our retirement account to buy another woman's engagement ring, and how the whole wedding fell apart before he ever got the chance to wear the tuxedo. I found the first message on a Tuesday. Richard's phone buzzed on the counter while he was in the shower. I wasn't snooping. I was wiping down that same counter I'd wiped every morning for 31 years. The name on the screen said Amelia, not a client, not a coworker, a woman with a heart next to her name. Can't stop thinking about last night. Same time Thursday. I set the phone down exactly where it had been sitting. Screen down. I didn't say a word when he came out in his towel. And that quiet dinner was only the first thing about to surprise her. Hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the ending, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. I waited 3 days. I wanted proof nobody could argue with. Thursday, I followed him. He parked outside a fitness studio on the edge of town. A woman came out to meet him at his car. Blonde, maybe 32. She kissed him on the mouth in the parking lot like it was old news. That night, I put his phone on the table between us at dinner. "Who's Amelia?" I said. He didn't flinch. "Amelia Winslow, and I'm not going to pretend I'm sorry." 35 years, and that was the apology I got. "She makes me feel alive," he said. "You stopped trying a long time ago." I pulled the credit card statement out of the drawer the next morning. Studio membership twice a week, going back 14 months. Not 6, 14. He'd been lying to me since before his own father's funeral. I didn't scream. I picked up his plate, still half full, and scraped it into the trash. The next morning, I packed his suitcases myself. I didn't cry doing it. I folded his shirts the way I always had, sleeves crossed behind the back, because habits don't leave just because a marriage does. I zipped the last one shut in our half-emptied bedroom. His phone kept lighting up on the nightstand while I worked. Amelia's name, twice, 3 times. By the time he got home from work, both bags were waiting by the door. "You're that ready to get rid of me?" he said. "You already left," I said. "I'm just catching up." He reached for the china cabinet on his way out. "I want my mother's china, it's mine." I handed him one chipped bowl from the back of the shelf. "That's what's yours," I said. "The set stays." He didn't argue. He just left with a bowl and 2 suitcases. 2 days later, he came back for his golf clubs. Amelia came with him this time, waiting by the garage in sunglasses she didn't need for an overcast afternoon. "You could at least look happy for him," she said, arms crossed, like she'd earned the right to say it. "I'll get there," I said, "right after you learn his coffee order." She didn't have an answer for that. Richard grabbed the clubs and didn't look at either of us on his way back to the car. He moved in with Amelia within the week. Kingston is a small town. Everyone at the grocery store knew before I'd told my own sister. Mrs. Delgado cornered me by the produce section. "I heard he's renting the Marsh Street condo, with her." She said it like she was handing me a gift. I thanked her for the tomatoes and left. The diner waitress, Carol, who'd served us anniversary dinners for a decade, sat me at my usual booth and didn't ask where Richard was. She already knew. Half the town had seen his truck outside the studio for over a year. A week after that, a text came in from Richard. A list. The recliner, the lawnmower, the good ladder from the garage, half of the patio set. Nothing about how I was doing. Nothing about the 35 years attached to any of it. Just a list, like I was a rental company he was settling up with. I wrote back one line. "Come get the recliner. The rest stays until a judge says otherwise." He didn't reply. 2 hours later, Lydia texted me a single word. "Good." Richard called 2 weeks later, not to apologize, to talk about the house. "I want my half," he said. "Amelia and I are looking at places. We need the capital." 6 weeks in, and it was already we. I called Lydia Sheldon that night. She'd been my closest friend since nursing school, and she'd become a family law attorney 20 years ago, mostly, she liked to joke, because of men like Richard. He wants to sell the house, I told her. Let him try, Lydia said. You've been on that deed since 1994. He doesn't get to decide that alone. Richard didn't like hearing that from her either. He showed up 2 days later, Amelia waiting at the curb with the engine running, like she couldn't stand to be seen walking up my driveway. You're being difficult, he said. I'm being 35 years married to you, I said. There's a difference. He looked past me at the porch, at the flower beds I'd planted, at the life we'd built, like he was pricing it for sale. Lydia says I keep the house, I told him. Tell Amelia the capital isn't coming from here. He left without another word. Amelia never rolled down the window. 3 days later, Carol called me at home. You should sit down for this one, she said. Richard had asked Amelia to marry him? At the studio. In front of her regular 6 a.m. class. 6 weeks. 35 years reduced to 6 weeks, and a ring bought on a payment plan Carol's cousin had processed at the jewelry counter downtown. My sister called an hour after that, already furious on my behalf. I'll drive down this weekend, she said. We'll key his truck, I'm only half joking. Don't, I said. I don't want anything of his touched. I don't want anything of his thought about. Linda, he proposed in 6 weeks. I heard, I said, let him. She went quiet on the line, then said the thing I hadn't asked her to say. You sound different already. I heard the rest of it a few days later, secondhand, the way everything in Kingston travels. Richard had been telling people at the studio that he'd saved Amelia from a bad breakup, that he was the reason she was doing so well now, like her whole recovery ran through him. He never once mentioned the wife he'd stepped over to get there. A friend forwarded me a photo 2 days after that. Amelia had posted it herself, her and Richard on a rooftop bar downtown, captioned finally starting my real life. 40-some comments under it. One stranger had written, isn't he still married? Amelia deleted the comment within the hour, but not before 3 people had already screenshotted it. The next morning, I cleared out his side of the closet. Not out of anger, out of space. I'd wanted a reading corner for 10 years and never once had the room to build one. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen for the first time in 35 years with no one else's schedule to plan around. I made myself a real dinner, not his favorite. Mine. It was the first meal I'd cooked for just me since I was 24 years old. Richard filed for divorce on a Monday. I'd already filed the Friday before. Lydia handed the sheriff's deputy a copy before Richard's own lawyer had finished printing his. Beat him to it, she said. Judges remember who moved first. Richard called within the hour, furious. You didn't even talk to me first. You didn't talk to me before you signed a lease, I said. We're even. 2 days later, I found out he'd tried to pull $11,000 from our joint savings account. The bank flagged it and called me before it cleared, since both our names were still on it. For what? I asked the teller. He said it was for a security deposit, she said, on a wedding venue. I moved what was left into an account with only my name on it that same afternoon. Richard texted an hour later. Why is the account empty? I didn't answer. Lydia answered for me in a letter with a case number on it. That Thursday, Amelia's engagement post showed up again, this time with a ring, not a small one. My neighbor Frank, who fixes lawnmowers for half the block, whistled when he saw it on his daughter's phone. That's a 2-carat stone, he said. Richard doesn't make that kind of money. He was right. Richard didn't. I found out 3 weeks later exactly where it came from, when the retirement account statement showed a $38,000 withdrawal I hadn't authorized, dated the same week as the ring. Lydia froze the account within a day of me forwarding her the statement. This is what we call marital waste, she said. Judges hate this more than affairs. 2 days after that, my pension office called to confirm a beneficiary change request Richard had submitted online, listing Amelia in place of me. My name had been on that pension since 1996. I hadn't authorized a thing. It's rejected either way, the woman on the phone told me. You're the named spouse until the decree is final, but I wanted you to know he tried. I sat with the phone in my lap for a minute after she hung up. 30 years of my own paycheck, and he'd tried to hand it to a woman he'd known for 14 months. Richard showed up at the house that weekend, not to apologize, but to ask for the boat. It's rusting in your driveway, he said. Just let me store it somewhere. Store it at Amelia's, I said. I hear she's got a 2-carat driveway now. He didn't have anything for that. He left without the boat. That same week, I came home to find the back door unlocked and Richard's truck gone from the driveway. Nothing was missing except the fireproof box from the closet where we'd kept the deed and both our passports. I called a locksmith that afternoon. He rekeyed every door in the house in under 2 hours. Ex-husband? He asked, handing me the new keys. Soon to be, I said. Richard called that night, annoyed he couldn't get back in. I just wanted the box, he said. It has my birth certificate in it. You should have asked, I said, politely, before letting yourself in. It's still my house, too. Not with a key you're not supposed to have, I said, and hung up before he could argue it further. My daughter called the next morning, already crying before I said hello. Mom, is it true he's making you sell the house? He's trying, I said. He's not going to win. I can fly in, she said. I can bring the kids, we can stay with you, help you fight this. Finish your semester, I said. I've got Lydia. I've got this. She went quiet, then said the same thing my sister had. You sound different, Mom, stronger. I feel it, I said, and meant it more than I expected to. The following week, the florist who'd done our 30th anniversary called me directly. I know this is strange, she said, but Richard asked me to do his wedding flowers. I told him no. I wanted you to hear it from me before someone else told you wrong. I thanked her, I meant it. Carol at the diner started calling it the Kingston divorce, like it was the only one happening in the state. People I hadn't spoken to in years stopped me in the cereal aisle to say they were sorry, or that they'd never trusted Richard's handshake, or that Amelia had tried to get a discount at their shop using his name and been turned down. None of it made the ache go away completely, but none of it made me feel small either. I signed up for a pottery class the second week of that month. I'd wanted to since I was 34 years old and never had a free Tuesday night to spend on myself. Richard used to call it a phase whenever I brought it up. The first bowl I made collapsed on the wheel. The second one held. I brought clay dust home on my jeans and didn't have anyone to complain about the mess. It was the first mess in 35 years that belonged entirely to me. At the hardware store the following Saturday, buying glaze, I dropped a box of tools trying to carry too much at once. A man crouched down to help me gather them before I'd even said a word. You looked like you had a system, he said. I didn't want to ruin it. The system was falling apart before you got here, I said. He laughed, actually laughed at that. He introduced himself as David, said he'd been widowed almost 3 years now, and that the hardware store had become his version of therapy, one shelf bracket at a time. I didn't think much of it beyond a nice conversation with a stranger who carried my paint cans to the car. I had a divorce to finish and a life to rebuild, and neither of those had room in them yet for a man who fixed things for a living. Richard's next move came 2 days later. He wanted the wedding china after all, the full set this time, not the chipped bowl. I told you, I said. The set stays. Amelia wants a full service for the reception, he said, like that settled it. Then Amelia can register somewhere, I said, and hung up. Lydia called that same afternoon with worse news. Richard's lawyer was arguing the house itself should be sold, splitting it 50-50, claiming I couldn't afford the mortgage alone on a part-time nurse's pension. Can I asked her, quieter than I meant to. You can, she said, but it's going to be close for a while. You up for close? I've been close before, I said. I raised 2 kids on a nurse's schedule while he worked overtime that wasn't overtime. Lydia didn't laugh at that one. She just said, good, bring the bank statements Monday. Carol forwarded me the wedding registry 2 days later. Someone at the studio had shared the link, and it had made its way around town within hours. Crystal stemware, a $4,200 espresso machine, a honeymoon fund with a suggested contribution of $500 per guest. That's our anniversary trip fund, I said out loud, to no one, staring at the espresso machine. Richard and I had never once owned anything from that catalog in 35 years of marriage. The wedding date got posted online that weekend. 6 weeks from the proposal, just like everything else with Richard and Amelia. Fast, loud, and paid for with money that wasn't only his. Amelia's caption read no more waiting for anything. I read it twice, sitting in my kitchen with wet clay still under my fingernails, and felt something close to pity for a woman who didn't know yet what she'd married into. I didn't post anything back. I didn't need to. Monday morning, Richard's lawyer sent a letter demanding I vacate the house within 30 days pending sale, citing financial hardship of maintaining the property alone. I read it standing in the kitchen, coffee going cold in my hand. Lydia read it over the phone that night and went quiet for a second too long. "He's bluffing," she said, "but it means he's scared. Scared people get sloppy. Sloppy people make mistakes we can use." I hung up and looked around the kitchen. 35 years of dinners in that room. A house he wanted sold out from under me 6 weeks after he moved out of it. I wasn't leaving. Not for him, and not for the woman wearing his mother's future. Lydia filed a response to the vacate letter by Wednesday morning, attaching the $38,000 withdrawal, the pension beneficiary attempt, and the $11,000 Richard had tried to pull from savings. "Judges don't like patterns," she told me. "1 bad withdrawal is a mistake. 3 is a strategy." The hearing got scheduled for the following month. Richard's lawyer called Lydia twice trying to get it moved up. She let both calls go to voicemail. "Let him sweat," she said. "Sweating husbands make better offers." Richard tried a softer approach 2 days later. He showed up at the house with coffee from the place we used to go on Sunday mornings, like that erased anything. "I brought your order," he said, holding it out. "Cinnamon, extra shot." "You remember the coffee order," I said, "and forgot the marriage. That's about right." I didn't take the cup. He left it on the porch rail and drove off. Amelia's rental turned out to be smaller than the pictures she'd posted. My neighbor Frank's daughter worked the leasing office and mentioned, without me even asking, that the 2-bedroom oasis from Amelia's caption was actually a 1-bedroom with a Murphy bed. Richard called that same week asking if he could store some boxes in my garage, temporarily. Tools, winter clothes, things that didn't fit in a 1-bedroom with a Murphy bed. "Store them at the 2-carat oasis," I said, and hung up before he could explain further. The craft fair posted sign-ups for vendor tables that Thursday. I signed up on impulse, entering 4 bowls and a set of mugs I'd made in class. My instructor said the glaze work was strong enough to sell. I sold every piece by noon on Saturday. A woman bought 2 mugs and told me they reminded her of something her grandmother used to make. I hadn't made anything anyone wanted in longer than I could remember. David was 3 tables down, selling handmade birdhouses from reclaimed wood. He came by during a lull and bought the last bowl before I could even put a price tag back on it. "You're better at this than you let on," he said. "I had a good teacher," I said, "mostly myself." He laughed at that, the same easy laugh from the hardware store. He asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime, not at the place Richard used to bring me from, a different place, one that had opened after my marriage had already started dying. I said yes before I'd fully thought it through, which surprised me more than it should have. We met that Tuesday. He told me about his wife, Margaret, 3 years gone now to cancer that took 18 months to finish its work. He didn't cry telling me. He just went quiet for a second, the way people do when a wound is old enough to touch without flinching, but never old enough to stop mattering. "I used to think the hardest part would be the funeral," he said. It wasn't. The hardest part was the Tuesday 6 months later when I realized I'd stopped setting 2 coffee cups out. I told him about the golf clubs, about the china. About 35 years reduced to a text message list of furniture. "He sounds like a man still deciding who he wants to be," David said. "You sound like someone who already decided." I didn't correct him. He told me he still tended Margaret's rose garden every Sunday, hadn't missed a week since she died. "People think it's strange," he said, "keeping a dead woman's roses alive." "I think it's the least strange thing I've heard in months," I said. We had coffee again the following week. Then again the week after that, a standing Tuesday that neither of us called a date out loud, though it clearly was one. My daughter asked about him on our next call, careful, like she expected me to get defensive. "Mom, are you seeing someone already?" "I'm having coffee with a widower who fixes birdhouses," I said. "Nobody's getting remarried." "Good," she said, "because if he's decent, I want to actually meet him this time. Not find out from a screenshot like I did with Amelia's ring." "He's decent," I said, and meant it more than I expected to. Richard found out about the coffee within 4 days. Kingston doesn't keep secrets longer than that. He called that night, and for the first time since the suitcases, he sounded rattled instead of righteous. "You're already seeing someone," he said. I'm having coffee with a friend, I said. You're planning a wedding registry with a $4,200 espresso machine. Which one of us moved on faster? That's different. It's really not, I said, and hung up. Richard drove out to the hardware store the next afternoon. David told me about it later, unbothered, like it was a minor errand someone had interrupted. He asked me what my intentions were, David said, like I was 17 and he was somebody's father. What did you tell him? That Margaret's been gone 3 years, and I know exactly what I want this time, David said, and that he might want to worry less about my intentions and more about his own bank account. Richard hadn't liked that answer. He'd left without buying whatever he'd come in for. 2 days later, Amelia showed up at the craft fair's second Saturday, uninvited, standing at the edge of my table with her arms crossed the way she had at the garage. Richard's upset, she said. He says you're humiliating him around town. I'm selling mugs, I said. If that humiliates him, that's a him problem. You could at least pretend to be moving on quietly, she said. I am moving on, I said. Quietly was never a requirement. She left without buying anything. David, 3 tables down, gave me a small nod that said he'd heard every word and approved of exactly none of what she'd tried. The hearing date got moved up unexpectedly, 2 weeks earlier than planned, after Richard's lawyer filed a motion claiming financial urgency. Lydia wasn't worried. He's rushing because the wedding's in 5 weeks, she said. He wants this settled before he walks down an aisle he can't afford. 2 days after that, Lydia called with news that made her laugh out loud on the phone, something I hadn't heard her do through any of this. Richard's lawyer had subpoenaed my bank records, hoping to prove I was hiding assets. He got my $300 craft fair earnings, Lydia said, and a spreadsheet of your pottery supply receipts. Meanwhile, his own client can't explain a $38,000 withdrawal to a jewelry store. I could not have asked for a better exhibit. The venue for the wedding called Richard directly that same week to confirm the deposit. Carol heard about it from her cousin, who worked the front desk. The deposit had been paid, non-refundable, from an account that was now frozen pending the hearing. He's already out $4,000, Lydia told me, on a wedding he might not be able to afford to finish paying for. I didn't feel sorry for him. I'd spent 35 years learning what it looked like when Richard ran out of ways to talk his way out of something. Lydia and I went over the file the night before court, every withdrawal, every screenshot, every text message printed and tabbed in order. She closed the folder and looked at me across the table. You could have folded 8 weeks ago, she said. Most people do. I raised 2 kids and worked nights for a decade, I said. Folding was never really an option I had access to. The night before the hearing, Richard called one last time, not about the house, about us. Did we really have 35 years, or did I imagine most of it? He asked, quieter than I'd heard him in months. You had 35 years, I said. You just decided somewhere around year 34 that it wasn't enough anymore. He didn't answer. For the first time since this started, I heard something that sounded almost like regret in the silence. It didn't change anything. Regret arriving this late doesn't undo a lease signed months in advance or a ring bought with someone else's retirement money. I hung up and laid out my clothes for the hearing. Court in the morning. A man across the room who used to know every version of me and had traded all of them for one that came with a 2-carat stone and a Murphy bed. I slept better than I had in months. The judge didn't take long. 40 minutes, most of it Richard's lawyer trying to explain a $38,000 withdrawal to a jewelry store as personal financial planning. The judge wasn't buying it. Marital waste, she called it, the same phrase Lydia had used weeks earlier. She ordered Richard to reimburse half of every dollar he'd pulled and awarded me the house outright, no forced sale, no 30-day countdown. Richard sat frozen at his own table. His lawyer whispered something to him. He didn't respond. Mr. Talbot, the judge said, you had 35 years to build equity in this marriage. You don't get to spend the last 6 weeks of it and call the remainder a fair split. Nobody in the gallery said a word. I felt Lydia's hand find mine under the table, just once, and let go. Outside the courthouse, he caught up to me in the parking lot. You destroyed me in there, he said. You destroyed yourself in there, I said. I just brought the receipts. He didn't have anything for that. He got in his car and drove off before Amelia, waiting in the passenger seat, could even ask how it went. She found out anyway. Carol heard it from the courthouse clerk by lunchtime, and by dinner half of Kingston knew Richard owed his soon-to-be ex-wife $19,000 on top of losing the house fight entirely. Richard tried one more move that week. He called the venue directly, asking if he could push the wedding date back for financial reasons, without telling Amelia first. The venue coordinator, who happened to be Frank's niece, told Amelia herself when she called to confirm the flowers. Amelia showed up at Richard's rental screaming, loud enough that the neighbors called it in. I only knew because the same neighbors told Carol, who told me over pie the next morning. "She's furious," Carol said. "Apparently the honeymoon fund covered exactly one flight, not two." I didn't gloat, I just ordered a second slice. Richard called that night, quieter than I'd heard him in the entire divorce. "Did you tell the venue to leak that?" "I haven't spoken to a single vendor in this town," I said. "You did that all on your own." "Amelia thinks I'm broke," he said. "You are broke," I said. "You spent 35 years of equity on a 2-carat ring and a wedding you can't finish paying for." He hung up first for once. David came to dinner 2 weeks later, the first time meeting my daughter in person instead of over video calls. He brought a birdhouse he'd made shaped like our old house, down to the porch railing, a detail I hadn't even described to him in that much specificity. "I looked it up online," he admitted. "The listing photos are still up from when you two got married there." My daughter watched him hand it to me and turned to me later in the kitchen, quiet, doing dishes. "He pays attention," she said. "Dad never once remembered which mug I liked." "He remembers everything," I said. "It's strange how much that matters now." Lydia met him the following week, invited herself over under the excuse of dropping off paperwork, and stayed for 2 hours asking him questions like she was cross-examining a witness. "He passes," she told me on the porch afterward. For what it's worth, coming from someone who's seen 30 years of husbands. "It's worth a lot," I said. Richard showed up unannounced 2 days after that, asking for the photo albums from the attic, our wedding, both kids' childhoods, 35 years of Christmases in cardboard boxes. "You can have copies," I said. "The originals stay with the kids' history, not with whoever's living in a Murphy bed apartment this month." He didn't argue. He'd stopped arguing about most things since the ruling. Richard's retaliation came fast after the reimbursement order. He filed a motion claiming I'd hidden income from the craft fair sales, demanding an audit of my business. Lydia laughed reading it over the phone. $340 in mugs, she said. "I'll have the accountant's letter to the judge by Friday. This is going to embarrass him more than it embarrasses you." It did. The judge dismissed the motion in writing, calling it not a serious use of the court's time. Richard's lawyer billed him for the filing anyway. The caterer called Richard that same week to confirm the final headcount and deposit balance. Richard asked for another 2 weeks to pay it. The caterer told him politely that the date would be released to another couple if the balance wasn't settled by Friday. Amelia showed up at my house that afternoon, no warning, standing on the porch where Richard used to leave cold coffee. "Did you do this?" she said. "The caterer, the venue, all of it." "I filed for divorce," I said. "That's the only thing I did." Everything after that was Richard's math, not mine. "He said you'd try to ruin us." "He said a lot of things to me too once," I said. "Turns out he wasn't telling the truth then either." She stood there a second longer, arms not crossed this time, and for the first time since the garage, she looked less like a woman who'd won something and more like one starting to wonder what exactly she'd signed up for. She left without another word. Amelia posted less after that. No wedding countdown, no registry updates, no rooftop photos. Carol noticed first, the way she noticed everything. "Someone at the studio said they had a fight about moving the date again," Carol told me. "Second one this month." I didn't need to gloat about that one either. I was too busy planning something of my own. David asked me, over coffee that Tuesday, if I wanted to help him redo Margaret's rose garden. Not replace it. Just bring it back to what it used to be together, since he'd let it go a little wild the past year without meaning to. "I'd like that," I said. "I've got a lot of Saturdays open these days." "I noticed," he said, and smiled in a way Richard hadn't smiled at me in over a decade. "We started that Saturday. I pulled weeds while he rebuilt a trellis Margaret had planted climbing roses on years before. He didn't talk much while he worked, just hummed something I didn't recognize, and it was the first quiet I'd sat in for months that didn't feel like waiting for the next bad phone call. "She would have liked you," he said, out of nowhere, kneeling in the dirt. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just kept pulling weeds until the bed was clear. Richard tried one final thing before the reimbursement deadline. He asked Lydia, through his own lawyer, for an extension, claiming the wedding costs had left him unable to pay on time. Lydia's answer was one line. He had 35 years to plan for this moment. He gets 30 days like everyone else. The extension was denied. Richard paid the $19,000 4 days late, with a penalty attached, straight out of an account Amelia didn't know existed until the transfer notification hit both their phones at once, since he'd never taken her name off the joint alert. She called him about it in the hardware store parking lot, loud enough that David heard the whole thing from where he was loading his truck. He didn't need to tell me the words. Half the parking lot heard them. That Friday, Amelia posted for the first time in 2 weeks, not about the wedding. A single photo of herself at the gym, caption turned off, comments turned off. Richard didn't post anything at all. The wedding was still 6 weeks out. Something in the way this town whispered told me it wasn't going to make it there quietly. David walked me to my car that evening after we'd finished the rose bed, hands still smelling like turned soil. "Whatever happens with them," he said, "it's not your circus anymore." "Feels like it still follows me into every parking lot in this town," I said. "Then we'll need a bigger garden," he said, "so you've got somewhere quieter to stand." I laughed harder at that than I had in months. It was the first joke in a long time that didn't come with a price attached to it. David asked me to move in 3 weeks after the rose garden, standing in his kitchen holding 2 mismatched mugs like he'd rehearsed the moment and forgotten the rest of the script. "Not right away," he said. "Whenever it stops feeling fast. I just wanted you to know the offer's there." "It already stopped feeling fast a while ago," I said. "We didn't rush it. We spent Saturdays boxing up Margaret's old craft supplies for donation, one shelf at a time, David narrating a small memory with each item before letting it go. He kept exactly 3 things: her wedding ring, a chipped teacup, and a photo from their honeymoon. Everything else went to a church sale 2 towns over. I brought over my pottery wheel the following week. He cleared out half his garage without me asking. "You don't have to make room this fast," I said. "I've had 3 years of empty shelves," he said. "I'd rather they be full of something again." We picked out paint for the guest room together the next Saturday, a soft green neither of us had grown up with in a marriage before. Richard had always chosen the colors in our house. I hadn't realized how much I'd wanted to choose one myself until I stood in the hardware store holding 2 nearly identical swatches, actually deciding. "This one," I said, and David didn't ask why. He just bought 2 gallons and started taping the trim that same afternoon. Lydia stopped by that evening to drop off paperwork and stayed for dinner, watching David flip pancakes for a Sunday night breakfast neither of us had planned. "I've represented 100 women leaving men like Richard," she said quietly, once David had stepped out to the garage. "Most of them don't get this part, the good part after." "I didn't think I would either," I said. "You earned it," she said. "Don't let him make you forget that." Richard's wedding kept sliding sideways. Carol relayed most of it secondhand from the caterer, who'd started venting to anyone who'd listen after chasing 2 more late payments. "They fought at the tasting," Carol said. "Amelia wanted the filet. Richard said they were doing chicken now, in front of the whole staff." 2 days later, Frank's niece at the venue told him Amelia had shown up alone to walk the ceremony space, crying in the parking lot before she even went inside. The studio where Amelia worked cut her hours the same week. After a client complained, she'd spent an entire session on the phone arguing with someone instead of coaching. Everyone at the front desk knew exactly who the someone was. I didn't feel triumphant hearing it. I felt something closer to recognition. I knew exactly what that parking lot felt like. Richard called me that week, out of nowhere, voice flat. "Did you know weddings cost this much?" "I paid for ours," I said. "Both of us did together." "That's usually how it works." "Amelia thinks I'm cutting corners on purpose." "Are you?" He didn't answer that. I didn't push. The following Tuesday, my daughter flew in to finally meet David in person, not over video, not through a photo of a birdhouse. She hugged him before she'd even set her bag down. Mom told me about the roses, she said. Show me. He walked her through the garden for 20 minutes while I watched from the porch. She came back inside with dirt on her shoes and something settled in her face I hadn't seen since before the divorce started. He's good, Mom, she said. Really good. Different kind of good than Dad. I know, I said. It took me 35 years to learn the difference. Dad called me last week, she said, quieter. Asked if I could talk Amelia's parents into helping cover the venue balance. Like I'm supposed to fundraise for his wedding. What did you tell him? That I hoped they worked things out, she said, and that I wasn't calling anyone on his behalf. Ever. I hugged her for that, longer than either of us expected. Before she flew home, she asked if she could come back for the festival. I want to see you two walk in somewhere together, she said. Properly, in front of everyone. You'll have a front row seat, I said. Richard tried one more legal maneuver that week, filing to reduce the reimbursement schedule, claiming the wedding costs had left him in genuine hardship. Lydia forwarded me the judge's response before I'd even finished my coffee. Denied. The judge's note read, respondent's financial hardship is self-inflicted and not grounds for modification. He's not going to stop trying, Lydia told me on the phone, but he's also not going to win. There's a difference between fighting and flailing, and he's been flailing since the hearing. Amelia showed up at my house again that Thursday, this time without the arms-crossed posture from before. She looked tired in a way makeup couldn't quite cover. Did you know he cheated on his first fiancée too? She said. Before you. Someone finally told me last week. I hadn't known that. Neither had she, apparently, until 7 weeks into an engagement. I'm not here to compare notes, I said, but I'm not surprised either. I thought I was different, she said. So did I said. 35 years ago. She left quieter than she'd arrived. I didn't feel the satisfaction I expected to feel. Mostly I felt sorry for a version of myself I recognized in her, 20 years earlier, standing in someone else's driveway convinced she was the exception. Richard called that same night, later than he usually called, his voice thick like he'd been drinking or crying or both. Do you ever miss it? He asked. Us, the house, any of it. I miss who I thought you were, I said. I don't miss who you turned out to be. I don't know how I got here, he said. You got here one lie at a time, I said, the same way anyone does. He didn't call again after that. Kingston announced the dates for the fall festival that same week, the whole town's biggest event, 3 weeks out. David asked if I'd go with him, publicly, no more sneaking coffee at the place Richard never went to. Everyone will see us, he said. I want them to. So do I said. Richard heard about the festival plans within days, the way he heard about everything now, through a town that had stopped keeping his secrets a long time ago. He called Lydia's office directly, not me, asking if the reimbursement deadline could be pushed past the festival date. Lydia's answer didn't need a lawyer to translate. No. 3 days before the festival, Amelia posted for the first time in a month, not about the wedding. A single line with no photo attached, taking some time to think. Richard didn't post anything. He hadn't posted anything in weeks. I reserved a booth at the festival craft market that same week, my name printed on the vendor list next to David's birdhouses for the first time. The coordinator, an old friend from church, hugged me when I turned in the form. Everyone's going to be talking about this one, she said. The whole town's watched this play out for months. Let them talk, I said. I've got nothing left to hide from any of them. I picked out a dress for the festival that Saturday, something I hadn't worn in years, sitting untouched in the back of my closet since before things went quiet between Richard and me. David saw me try it on in the mirror and didn't say anything for a second. What? I said. Nothing, he said. I just don't think Richard has any idea what he's about to walk into. The Kingston Fall Festival opened under string lights, and a sky that hadn't decided yet if it wanted rain. David's booth sat 2 rows from mine, birdhouses lined up beside my glazed bowls, both of us sold nearly out by 6 o'clock. Mrs. Delgado stopped by my booth within the first 20 minutes, buying a bowl she clearly didn't need. You two walked in together like you'd been doing it for years, she said. It's good to see you standing up straight again, Linda. Lydia showed up around 6, off the clock for once, buying one of David's smaller birdhouses for her office window. Figured I'd see the man responsible for all your good moods lately, she said, shaking his hand. Approved. My daughter worked the register at my table for an hour so I could walk the courtyard with David. Everyone keeps staring at you too, she whispered on my way past. In a good way. Richard arrived alone around 7. No Amelia beside him, no ring visible on his own hand, where he'd started wearing one to match hers weeks earlier. Carol spotted him first and mouthed it across the crowd to me before I even turned around. He didn't come near my booth right away. He drifted the edges of the courtyard, hands in his pockets, watching. The temperature dropped fast once the sun went down, the way it does in Kingston every October. I hadn't brought a jacket. David noticed before I said a word, slid his own coat off his shoulders, and settled it over mine without asking. I looked up and found Richard across the courtyard, frozen mid-step, watching the exact moment David's coat landed on my shoulders like he was watching something get taken from him a second time. He didn't move for a long moment, then he crossed the courtyard straight toward us. "Can we talk?" he said, eyes only on me, like David wasn't standing right there. "You can talk to both of us," I said. "That's how this works now." Richard's jaw tightened. "Amelia left last night," he said, packed a bag, said she couldn't marry a man everyone in town felt sorry for. "That's not my problem to fix," I said. "She took the ring too," he added, like he needed someone to hear it out loud. "Said she'd sell it and put the money toward her own place." "Smarter than she looked at the garage," I said. "I'm not asking you to fix it," he said. "I'm asking if any of this," he gestured at David, at the booth, at me and his coat, "is real or if you're just doing it to hurt me." David spoke before I could. "She's not doing anything to hurt you," he said, calm, no edge in it at all. "You did that part yourself, months before either of us met." Richard didn't have an answer for that. He looked at me instead. 35 years, he said. "Doesn't that mean anything to you anymore?" "It means I know exactly what I lived through," I said, "and exactly what I'm not going back to." A small crowd had gathered without meaning to, the way crowds do at festivals, drawn by raised voices even when the voices weren't actually raised. Carol stood near the edge, arms crossed, not bothering to pretend she wasn't listening. Someone near the funnel cake stand murmured, "Is that her husband?" Someone else answered, "Ex, as of a few weeks ago." And apparently his fiancée too, as of last night. The first voice didn't say anything else after that. "You humiliated me," Richard said. "In court, in this town, everywhere I go." "You did that the day you told me Amelia made you feel alive," I said. "I just stopped hiding it for you." Amelia's absence answered a question the whole courtyard had clearly been wondering about all evening. Frank leaned over to his wife and said, not quietly enough, "Guess the wedding's off then." Richard turned toward the voice, humiliated fresh, and turned back to me instead. "You could have at least given me somewhere to land," he said. "Some dignity." "You had dignity," I said. "You spent it on a 2-carat ring and a Murphy bed apartment." David's hand found the small of my back, not pulling me away, just steady. Richard looked at that hand longer than he looked at anything else. "I loved you," Richard said, quieter now, the crowd starting to lose interest and drift back to their own conversations. "Even through all of it, I want you to know that." "I believe you loved a version of me," I said. "The one who never asked for anything. That version's gone. She's not coming back for you or anyone else." He stood there a second longer, looking between David and me, the booth full of empty spaces where bowls used to sit, the coat still resting on my shoulders. "I made a mistake," he said. "A real one, not the kind you fix with an apology." "No," I said, "not that kind." "Is that all I get?" he said. "Jokes about the ring." "You had 35 years of everything else," I said. "Jokes are what's left." He looked at David one more time, like he was searching for something to say that would land, and came up empty. "I hope he's better to you than I was," Richard said finally. It was the first true thing he'd said all night. "He already is," David said, quiet, not unkind. But that was never a high bar to clear. Richard flinched at that more than at anything I'd said all evening. He turned and walked back through the courtyard alone, past booths he used to walk through with me every October for 3 decades, and didn't look back once. Carol came over the second he was out of earshot. "You didn't even raise your voice," she said. "Not once." I didn't need to, I said. He heard it anyway. Frank's wife came by next, still holding the mug she'd bought an hour earlier. Whole town's going to be talking about this by breakfast, she said. Let them, I said. For once it won't be a story I'm ashamed of. Mrs. Delgado, on her way out, squeezed my arm. I've known you 15 years, Linda. I've never seen you stand like that. I've never had a reason to before, I said. David wrapped his arm around me properly then, in front of the whole courtyard, in front of anyone from Kingston who still had a single question about where I stood. You all right? He asked. Better than I've been in months, I said, and meant every word of it. My daughter found us 20 minutes later, having watched the entire thing from behind the register. That was the calmest destruction of a man I've ever seen, she said. That's the only kind worth doing, I said. Somewhere behind us, Richard's truck pulled out of the festival lot too fast, tires loud against wet pavement, disappearing down Main Street alone. I didn't watch him go. I was already looking at the string lights, at David's arm still around me, at a night I'd remember for reasons that had nothing to do with the man who used to share my name. We closed the booths together an hour later, boxing up the last few bowls and birdhouses side by side. My daughter carried the register box to the car and came back grinning. So, she said, are you two officially something now, in front of the entire town? We were something before tonight, David said. Tonight just made it official for everyone else. I handed him his coat back once we reached the car. He shook his head. Keep it, he said. I've got somewhere warmer to walk you home to now anyway. Richard called Lydia's office the next morning, not to fight, just to ask for a payment plan on what he still owed me. Lydia approved it in an email that took her 4 minutes to write. He sounded different, she told me. Smaller. I didn't ask what she meant, I already knew. His first payment bounced 2 weeks later. Lydia's office sent a second notice. The third payment came through late, from an account with a bank name I didn't recognize, one town over from where he used to say he'd never live. His employer called him into a meeting that same month, after 2 clients complained he'd shown up late, distracted, asking to leave early twice in 1 week. Carol heard about the write-up from someone at his office and passed it along over pie the next morning. Richard had never missed a day of work in the 35 years I'd known him. Not once. The house Richard and Amelia had planned to move into together fell through within the week, the deposit forfeited since the wedding financing had collapsed with it. David mentioned he'd seen boxes going into a studio apartment above the hardware store, 2 blocks from the parking lot where Richard and Amelia had once argued loud enough for half the lot to hear. He tried listing our old furniture for sale online that same month, pieces he had no legal claim to anymore, to cover the deposit he'd lost. Lydia had the listings taken down within a day, citing the court order. Richard didn't try that particular trick twice. Amelia left Kingston entirely by the end of the month. Carol heard she'd taken a job 2 states over, somewhere nobody at the studio had ever heard of before. She sold the ring, just like she'd said she would, and never mentioned Richard's name to anyone in town again. She texted Carol once before she left, a single line Carol read to me over the phone. Tell her I'm sorry if that means anything at this point. I didn't ask Carol to text anything back. Some apologies don't need an answer to still land somewhere. Richard tried calling me twice more that fall. I let both calls go to voicemail. Lydia had been right about one thing from the very start. I didn't owe him a single explanation anymore, and I'd stopped feeling the pull to give him one. David and I moved the last of my boxes into his house on a Saturday in November, the rose garden finally full and stubborn against the first frost. My daughter flew in to help carry furniture and cried twice, once packing my old kitchen table, once seeing it set up new in David's dining room like it had always belonged there. You okay? I asked her. I'm better than okay, she said. I finally get to watch you be happy, instead of just okay. I unpacked the wedding china last, the full set Richard had once wanted to split at the driveway. David cleared an entire cabinet for it without me asking, the good dishes finally displayed instead of stored away for occasions Richard used to cancel at the last minute. They look better here, David said, setting the last plate in place. They finally are, I said. We stopped at a gas station on Route 9 that same week, filling up before a supply run for the wedding. Richard was 2 pumps over, alone, in a car I didn't recognize, looking older than the 6 months since the festival should have made him. He saw me. He didn't wave. I didn't either. David just squeezed my hand once and kept pumping gas like the moment didn't deserve any more than that. We didn't rush a wedding. We didn't need one to prove anything to a town that had already watched every part of this unfold in real time. We built something quieter instead, Sunday dinners, a garden that bloomed every spring exactly the way Margaret used to keep it, a house with 2 names on the mailbox instead of one man's assumptions. Lydia came to dinner most Fridays, still calling it, checking in on my favorite case, though the case had closed months earlier. She brought wine. David brought stories about Margaret that didn't hurt to hear anymore, not the way they used to. My daughter and her kids came for Christmas that year, the first holiday in 35 years that didn't involve planning around Richard's side of the family too. My grandson found the pottery wheel in the garage and wouldn't leave it alone the entire visit. "Grandma, can you make me a bowl like the ones at the fair?" he asked. "I can make you a dozen," I said, and meant it. David taught him how to whittle a birdhouse that same weekend. The two of them hunched over the workbench for hours while I watched from the doorway, a version of a family I hadn't let myself imagine having again. Richard sold his half of nothing, since there'd been nothing left to sell by spring. He moved out of Kingston entirely by summer, taking a job 2 towns over doing the same work he'd always done, minus the wife who used to plan around his schedule and the reputation he used to trade on at the studio. Carol told me the last of it over pie one morning, the way she'd told me most of it from the very beginning. He'd stopped coming into town at all by then, not for groceries, not for the diner, not even for the festival the following October. "Nobody's heard from him since," Carol said. "Not even Frank, and Frank hears from everybody." I didn't ask for more details. I didn't need them anymore. David asked me, that same afternoon, kneeling in the dirt of Margaret's garden with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, if I'd marry him properly this time, no rush, no deadline, whenever it stopped feeling too soon. "It stopped feeling too soon a long time ago," I said. "We got married the following spring, in that same garden, under an arch he'd built from reclaimed wood himself. My daughter walked me down a path of rose bushes instead of a church aisle. Lydia stood as my witness. Carol brought pie instead of a gift because she said that's what 30 years of friendship actually looks like. Richard wasn't invited. Nobody asked why. David went first with his vows, no note cards, just looking straight at me. "I stopped setting out 2 coffee cups a long time ago," he said. "I didn't think I'd ever need to buy a second mug again. I'm glad I was wrong." "You once told me I sounded like someone who already decided who she wanted to be," I said, when it was my turn. "You were right. I decided it was you." The officiant pronounced us married before the sun had fully set, string lights already glowing overhead, borrowed from the same festival supplier Kingston used every October. That night, I packed a suitcase for the honeymoon, folding my own clothes into it in a bedroom that had never once belonged to Richard. David's phone sat on the nightstand, quiet, no other woman's name ever going to light it up. I zipped the bag shut and looked at the room around me. Full, this time. Not half-emptied by anyone walking out the door. Richard traded 35 years for a version of me that never existed anywhere but in his own head. What he left behind built something neither of us could have predicted the night I zipped his suitcases shut myself and set them by the door. I didn't build this to prove anything to him. I built it because David asked what I wanted, for the first time in decades, and for the first time in decades, I finally had an answer worth packing a bag for. Stories like this one tend to leave a few quiet truths behind. That dignity is quieter than anger, and it lands harder in the end. That people who rush a new relationship are usually running from something they can't face. That keeping your own name on every account and every deed isn't distrust, it's survival. And that starting over, at any age, is its own kind of victory. Would you have stayed calm through all of it, or fought back the way she did? If you enjoyed this story, hit like and subscribe, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.